welcome everyone to Ronsdale's Zoom meeting. Not quite a launch, but it's going to be a discussion between two very, very fine authors. This is Trevor that we're seeing right now, Trevor Marc Hughes, who is the editor of the Mack Laing Journal. And I'll ask each of the discussants to talk a little bit about their books, just so that we all have a good sense of where they're coming from and where we should be. Okay. So I'll start now. Trevor, you're up. Why don't you take a few minutes, maybe up to 5, and tell us a bit about the book and what, some of the high points and what's really important for you, for us in this book about Mack Laing.
Okay, well, yeah, my name is Trevor Marc Hughes, and I worked on a book which contains the account Hamilton Mack Laing wrote of his transcontinental journey across the United States in 1915 on a Harley Davidson that he called Barking Betsy. In the early days of motorcycle travel, this was something of a departure for Laing in a lot of ways. He was something of a pioneer when very few people traveled across continents using the motorcycle. It had only been a few years earlier in 1903 that Mr. Harley and the two Mr. Davidsons put together their first engine, and that same year George A. Wyman made his that was I believe the first transcontinental journey across the continental United States on was a motorized bicycle. And Hamilton Mack Laing was a young writer and naturalist. He was at the beginning of his career, really. He was in his early 30s, and he was finishing up his studies in Brooklyn at the Pratt Institute. He was studying art there, and after his third year of 4 years of studies, he thought it'd be a good idea to buy a motorcycle. He bought a Harley Davidson 10F, and he rode from Brooklyn all the way to Winnipeg. He essentially rode home, and he wrote an article about it. At this point, he was a very busy freelance writer, and he wrote for magazines such as Outing, Recreation, Sunset. There's a whole list of others. And this was in 1914. He made this journey, and he wrote Gypsying on a Motorcycle, how a greenhorn rode from New York to Winnipeg and enjoyed the whole way. That was the title. I still can't forget that. That's quite a title. But it was for Outing magazine in 1915, and then the following year he decided to go across the country, and he'd take 6 weeks to do it on a different motorcycle. It was on a Harley Davidson 11F, and he did that over a 6-week period in 1915.
The interesting thing about him as well is that he was a naturalist. His main preoccupation was birds, and along the trip, you'd think a motorcycle would be very noisy, but he camped for the night, just out in the wilds, as it were. And then he would talk in his journal, handwritten journal, which Trevor found in the archives over in Victoria and edited. And he discovered that Laing was most interested in describing the birds and the bird songs and how the bird songs changed as he went across the continent. It's extraordinary, that this man, could just hear a bird song and immediately say what it was, and he'd be off and going.
Well, that's the extraordinary thing about the manuscript, which was introduced to me by historian and author and Laing's biographer Richard Mackey. he said at one point I'd written something for him for the Ormsby Review, and he saw in my bio that I was a motorcycle travel writer, and he said, "There's something I think you'd be interested in reading." And so, as you say, I went to BC Archives, and over several trips, I read this 148 typewritten pages, the 148 typewritten pages, and as you say, it was something that it's like no other piece of motorcycle travel writing I've ever read. He can recognize when he switched off the engine of his motorcycle, he could name a bird just from the song. And he was so well versed on these companions who were companions on the trip with him. Really, he did find eventually human companions, but for the most part, it was at the beginning he was just entranced by the natural world, and he felt that the motorcycle was the ideal form of transportation to get himself out there and to be connected. It is a really connected form of travel, and yeah, he had a very astute knowledge of birds as he got started. So it was this combination of his love for the open road and his love for the natural world.
And it wasn't just birds either, if I remember rightly. He had run-ins with snakes and with beetles and with badgers and all sorts of other animals too that beset him at night. And there were many, many times that he was warned not to go out and sleep because of some bad animal or else out there. So it wasn't just the birds that he was dealing
No,
with.
it's true, Geoff. No, he was in some towns. He had very stern warnings about not heading out in this direction, or and the creatures he found were not all benign. That's for sure. That beetle especially was. I think the way he describes that smell I was left behind after that beetle is something else.
Yes.
But yeah, but he for the early part of the manuscript, he really is involved in describing the bird life, but then eventually he comes to describe the human, the human beings that he was, I think, in many ways just trying to not be around for a while because he'd been in such a metropolitan center. But once he started to describe the United States in a time that was before their involvement in the First World War, and he really, I just remember him walking into essentially a diner in one place, and he just sort of came in all dusty with at this point he was traveling with his brother he called Frat, his brother Jim, and another travel companion, and he walked up and he was all dusty and he sat down. He was just sort of rubbing elbows with the real sort of working class Americans, and I think there was that aspect of it that he really liked describing.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it always came back to connecting with nature in some way.
Okay, so we move on to Geoff.
Right. Well, Horace Wrench is the subject of the biography I wrote, and he also started his journey in his early 30s, but his journey lasted the rest of his life. When he died, the Vancouver Sun called him most beloved man in northern British Columbia, and yet no one knows anything about him. And I think that's part of what intrigued me so much about him. And here was a man who contributed so much to the north, and yet in the south he's completely unknown. And on the Skeena River in northern BC, he was known by the name, but not many people knew much about him. So who was he? What did he do? He was a medical missionary who came out to British Columbia in 1900 when he was 34, gave up a good career in Toronto, and came out to Hazelton on the Skeena River, which is where the Bulkley River joins the Skeena. And there he built the first hospital in the Northern Interior, first nurses' school. He was also a farmer and established the farm that was so necessary to keep the hospital community fed and healthy during the winters. He was a magistrate. He was a doctor and surgeon, of course. He was also a community leader, leading the Red Cross in the area during the war. He was a Methodist minister. He was also an MLA in Victoria for 2 terms in the 1920s, where he earned a reputation as being a champion for public health insurance. And this in part led to the first public health insurance legislation in North America in 1936. It fell by the wayside in the lead up to the war, but it was one of the stepping stones to Canada Health Act and the Canadian medical system we have here today. So he was this person who had accomplished a huge amount during his life, and I felt his story needed telling. So that's in a nutshell what the book is about. It's his story, his accomplishments, and the community of Hazelton in which he lived as it developed through the years.
What did you draw on for this biography?
Well, in a way, it was as though a bomb had exploded amongst all the material about him and scattered the fragments everywhere. So it is very much a gathering up of information process. I had some letters written in 1906 from New York to his wife in Toronto at the time, because he was studying there. And then there are the archives in Victoria, a lot of papers there in various other people's journals and other people's papers. There are the United Church archives in Vancouver and in Toronto, where there are a lot of his professional letters, ones he wrote back to his bosses in the missionary offices back in Toronto. There were also the local newspapers, and the local newspapers are a mine of information about the area and the times. Because I'm very much an original sources historian, I'd really like to go back to the original documentation and the original letters, the original journals, because that's the way you can really get into the topic and find the evidence you need to support the facts. So it is very much and I'm sure Trevor could understand this, it's very much like a bird gathering information from all sorts of places. You pick a bit here, you pick a bit there, and you put it all together. And the problem is not so much after a while the gathering of the information, it's the selection and what you leave out, or what people tell you have to leave out, which is always painful to leave out information you think is so nice and so relevant, but which in fact does not advance the story, does not advance the biography.
Why did you begin writing your book?
Why did I begin writing the book?
Yeah.
Why did I begin writing the book? Well, the story had to be told. So the starting point was that my wife is Dr. Wrinch's granddaughter. So I've known about him since the early 80s. And I first visited Hazelton in 1980, and I went together with Horace's son, Harold, to Hazelton in 1982. So I've always had that knowledge about him. So the more I learned about him, the more I realized it wasn't just a family story. It was a story about someone who was a contributor to the history of the province. So certainly the starting point was the family connection. But writing a family story is one thing. Writing a biography about someone of some importance to provincial history is something else again. So I upped it a notch when I moved from the family story into the real history. So it was very much trying to record his accomplishments, and that led me into the whole story of his history. And I really started finding out so much more about him when I started digging into the story. And the whole chapters I learned about him that I didn't know before I started. And that was part of the fascinating story. As I did the research, I learned more, and that led me to more, and that led me to more. I didn't, for example, know that he had been a member of the Premier's Economic Council in the 1930s. Tallow had set up an economic council, a bit of a think tank, which was quite a novelty in those days, a think tank to advise him. And Dr. Wrinch was on that think tank for the 2 or 3 years it was in operation. I had no knowledge of that whatsoever. So it's a learning process as well as a writing process.
The impetus of it was when Richard Mackey had suggested I read this, because he knew that I'd traveled by motorcycle and wrote about my travels, and so he said, well, there's this something that I think you should see. And so he directed me to BC Archives, to the Laing papers, and I went to Victoria several times to read not only his the typewritten document, but his journals as well. And at that point, I thought, well, this is the richest bit of motorcycle travel writing I've ever read. You know, I can't believe this wasn't published. And of course, there's a story about why it wasn't published, which is in the afterword of the book. But I just thought he had traveled all this way, and he had taken so many pains to document what he did, and it was in a file, and that was it. So I thought that, you know, if people are going to enjoy it half as much as I did, then it's worth telling it. It's worth preparing it for publication.
Both books are about well-known figures in BC. Did you feel a lot of pressure to live up to their legacies? What do you feel you owed them on a personal level? Question to both of you. Who wants to start off?
Trevor, do you want to go first?
Oh, sure. Okay. Yeah. Thanks, Geoff. Yeah, I did. Very much so. I mean, again, kind of going back to the fact that this manuscript hadn't been published before, and it had been written close to a century before, and there, in a sense, there's just so much all the time that had passed since it had been typed up in the early 20s. I kind of felt that pressure. I felt the pressure of people who knew Hamilton Mack Laing as a certain person. People who knew him as the naturalist may not have known him as a motorcycle naturalist, and so I felt it was a section of his life, you know, and it was a section where he approached it with a great deal of passion and drive. I think he saw himself in this particular niche as the motorcycle naturalist, and I definitely wanted to get it right. You know, so there are the various visits to the archives, and also reading his motorcycle travel stories that he published in magazines, because he wrote quite a few articles, as I've written, in various magazines. So I kind of had that kind of a personal connection with him there as well, you know, as a freelance writer, as somebody who is familiar to the sort of freelance mentality of pitching your wares and hoping that somebody will take up the story. You know, but he was doing quite well. I mean, he was doing so well as a freelance writer that it paid for his tuition at the Pratt Institute in Brooklyn, New York, and allowed him to buy a motorcycle and paid for his room and board. So I have to say I admire him, his ability to be able to make such a good living at what he was doing. So yeah, I mean, all that to say that yes, I felt a certain degree of pressure to get it as right as I could.
Okay, thanks, Trevor.
Yeah, well, I take the opposite approach. I tried not to feel any such obligation because I was writing a biography and a history, and I felt I had to be as objective about the facts as I could and not be pressured into writing only the good stuff. So I deliberately tried to dig out whatever bad stuff I could as well to try and provide a balanced picture. So I think if any pressure there was from the ghost of Dr. Wrinch, it would have been to be truthful to the facts and not to try and gloss over any bad things or gloss over any problem areas, but to at least address them in some way, in some form. So I didn't feel I owed him more than the truth, more than objectivity. I think that's what a historian should be doing. I think historians work deductively, not inductively. That is, the primary obligation, in my mind anyway, is to work from the facts on the and then journey onwards to the conclusions or to the assessment or to the writing, and not start with the conclusion and then work backwards. Because the problem with working in that way is you tend to find only facts that support your conclusion, which is not how history, in my view, should be written. So objectivity is what I was aiming for. And I tried to be balanced. And whatever bad things there were, I tried to at least address in the book. Because I think that's what historians should do.
Is that something that you ever get? Writer's block?
No, I didn't actually. And I think that's probably more of a problem for a novelist or a poet. I'm thinking, because the problem soon became one of selecting the information and sorting the information rather than looking for the information. The structure of the book fell into place in half an hour because there was natural divisions. One is life in England, one is life in Ontario, coming out to Hazelton, building the hospital, going to New York, 2 or 3 chapters leading up to the First World War, post-war, MLA for his first term, MLA in the second term, and then retirement. So once I got that structure, and that happened very, very quickly, sort of fell into place naturally, it was a matter of just choosing and selecting from the material I had and was finding all the time, and putting it into the prose, into the text. And then it was selecting and then editing, revising, and then more editing. So there was a lot of massaging that went on. So there wasn't much of a writer's block.
Mm-hmm.
How about you, Trevor?
No, I mean, well, I mean that the amount that I wrote compared to service on the Skeena was it was much a smaller piece of my own. You know, like you say, there was the material to draw from. There was diaries. The thing about Laing was that he was a very disciplined diarist, and he so if anything was missing, any sort of furtherance of what happened in the manuscript that he typed up, there was plenty in the diaries to choose from. So there was quite a lot. He was it is his gift, I think, to posterity is that he wrote so many diaries. And I was, just before the pandemic, I was back in Victoria reading one of his diaries, and from 10 years afterwards, after the transcontinental journey, and the detail in them is incredible. I mean, I've picked up journaling and written diaries at different points in my life, but he was so meticulous in what he documented that there really is a lot of information to choose from there.
And for the journals that you read for the book, did you edit them? Did you revise them? Did you leave out parts? I mean, did you just take it verbatim?
No, I think there were bits that didn't get in, and that was not done lightly. But it was there were some moments that were taken out, but very few. I mean, there I'm trying to think of why they were let go, but there were some that didn't make the cut, so to speak. Well, one thing I do remember doing is for the afterword, is he ends the not to give too much away, but there's a kind of riding off into towards the sea kind of moment at the very end, and the journey actually didn't really end there in the sense that he continued on riding up to Portland, where his parents had retired to, and so I found that in the diaries. And found that he had Barking Betsy had actually stopped functioning just before he arrived there, and he called himself a very poor diagnostician when it came to determining what was wrong with his motorcycle. Maybe it was bad fuel. He picked up some bad fuel along his trip, that's for sure. But it turned out it was just a problem with his carburetor. He just had to adjust his carburetor air fuel mixture, and then he was on his way. But so those little bits didn't go into the actual manuscript or his account, but I did write that in the afterword.
Have you ever been tempted to do exactly the same trip?
Wow, that would be some trip. Yeah, I mean, I have been. Yeah, I have. But at this time in my life, it wouldn't work, because I was like this morning. I was at a hockey rink parking lot waiting for my son to come out with all of his gear on. I'm a hockey dad, proud hockey dad, and that's a big part of my life right now. I think in the time in which he traveled in his early 30s, I felt some envy. I have to admit that he had 6 weeks. He decided that what he was going to do, and he was going to draw a great deal of material from it for his writing, and he committed to it, and that he did it. And committing 6 weeks to travel, maybe someday. Maybe someday. I haven't ruled that out. Yeah.
At least Route 66.
Sorry, Geoff?
Or at least Route 66.
Route 66. It's funny you just mentioned that. I just read a book about Route 66. I just finished it yesterday. It's Billy Connolly's travels along Route 66. I don't know if you've read that, but he did a series about it. But yeah, there's some extraordinary roads to travel. One thing I had a question for you, which was at the beginning of the book, you talk about what should I call him? What should he be Horace?
Yes.
Should he be Wrench? Should he be Horace Wrench? And I kind of wrestled with that a bit in the afterword. How did you make your decision?
I wrestled with that because just to call him Wrench sounds rather abrupt. Horace Wrench sounds a bit too drawn out. Dr. Wrench is quite formal. We've always called him Horace in the family for as long as I've known about him. And we felt, this is something I discussed with my wife, of course, we felt that if we didn't call him Horace, we would be pushing him further away, and he would be a bit more remote. And I think I wanted to pull the reader in a bit further into intimacy with him to try and understand what he was about. I thought if I just called him Dr. Wrinch, that I'd be losing some of that potential for pulling the reader in to who he was as a person. You know, it's funny you put your finger on that, because that really was one of the things we talked about for quite a while. So we came down with Horace. You know, you have to put, you know, go with that.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it must be a common problem, but everyone calls everyone by their first name these days anyway, so I don't think it would be taken amiss. Just the way it was. In some ways, he was very progressive, and I think he might conceivably have accepted this. Conceivably.
Well, I think Ron did Ron have a question? Do I ever have a plans to go on travel similar to Laing? Were there any experiences in your own life where you could relate to Horace's life in such a remote part of British Columbia?
I thought about that one. Actually, no, there aren't. The only thing we have in common, I think, is that he came from England and I came from England, but he came as a 14-year-old alone in 1880, and I came as an adult in 1973 by plane. But there really aren't. I've never lived in the wilds. I don't have a medical background, nor do I have a church background. So I came at his story as a historian, not bringing any personal connection with him other than the family and the family connection. So it was really, in some ways, cutting from whole cloth. And that was fun. So I couldn't, in a way, like you with the motorcycle, I couldn't say, aha, I understand what his feeling must be at this point.
Yeah.
Because our paths are so completely different. But it was an interesting point, and made me think quite a bit about whether we did have anything in common. I don't think so, frankly.
Well, you were a professional person.
I was a lawyer, not a doctor. So that informs my wanting to use contemporaneous information and to test the facts very carefully. And I really did try to dig as deep as I could to find the facts and find the supporting evidence, if possible, to corroborate facts. And sometimes what I found out is very different from the mythology. For example, there was a pamphlet put out by the Methodist Missionary Society and this is coming to another one of your questions, Trevor. A pamphlet put out in the 1930s about his life, and it said he was planning to go to China, and one day he was invited into the office of Alexander Sutherland, who was head of Methodist missions, and the pamphlet says that Sutherland had asked him where he wanted to go, and Wrinch said, wherever it is hardest and I can do the best work for the Lord. And that's probably China, because all of his friends and all the missionaries were going to China at that time. And Sutherland said, well, there's a harder place for you to go to than China, and that is Hazelton on the Skeena River in northern British Columbia. Nice story, just nonsense though, I think. It's part of the starry-eyed Methodist missionaries are heroes line that came out in the 30s. In fact, I think China was one of the places he had on his shortlist. And much as a student wonders for a while which university to go to, UBC or Dalhousie or Mount Allison, I think he probably had a number of places on his list. And he first was encouraged to go to the Skeena River in 1896 and again in 1899. And the Methodist Missionary Board had their own ideas for him because they were reserving him for China. So he came up to the Skeena River. Also in China at that time, there was a Boxer Revolution that were doing a nice work in killing foreigners and particularly missionaries. So China was sort of cut off for him. But it shows that there's often a mythology at one level that you really have to dig down below to dig into the material and the contemporaneous material to find out what the truth was. So it's this digging into the facts that I like doing, and I enjoy doing that type of research. But I think it's very important for writing a biography to do that.
Mm. One of the things that I could certainly relate to with Horace as I was reading is I rode up to Hazelton and beyond a few years ago, and it was really 3 riding days till I could actually achieve it, till I could actually get there. And the story within the book about how the community was trying to encourage road travel, and Mr. Sands
yes.
Being the first man coming up there on his automobile. I could relate to that. Although all the roads I traveled were paved, I'm sure the roads he did weren't.
Oh, well, he didn't do it, of course.
Right.
That's the nice thing about that story. The first actual car to reach Hazelton from Vancouver all the way was in 1920. And even then they went through some deep mud in places. But that was really the first car to get there on its own. And as the story goes, Mr. Sands had to take apart his car and hire a mule train to take the car in pieces over to the road again through the difficult bits.
I know it was against the rules, but it sounded like it was undertaking all. You have to dismantle your car, put it on the back of a mule, and then take it on to the next stage.
Of course, they were spotted by a prospector who, knowing what was happening, hurried into Hazelton and told the story to a notary public, swore the affidavit, and I think he was paid off. No one wanted to spoil a good story. So Trevor, taking up another question, what message did you want people to take away from your book?
Oh, well, when it comes to Laing's travels, I mean, there are a few things. One is I think Laing's view on simplicity. One of the articles that I read as I was doing my research, that Laing wrote, he wrote it for Outing Magazine, I believe, and it was for Recreation, and it was called a Been There Motorcyclist Touring Outfit. He wrote an entire article about what he packed in his panniers, what he put into his motorcycle panniers.
Yeah, it looked
about 3,000 words. It's very detailed about a very civilized, sort of gentlemanly, a motorcycle gypsy's life on the road, and what you need to pack for your luncheon kit and your. It was all very civilized, but he went into great detail. So, but one of the things that he abhorred, I think, was traveling too fast. He saw a day where he traveled over 100 miles as being not really all that good. He took his time, and he took in the natural world, and that's how he wanted to do it. He set up. He got up quite early, and he would ride for a while, and then he would try and pick his campsite and make sure that he got there quite early in the afternoon so that he could set up his tent, set up his motorcycle, and the priority was to be, if ideally, underneath a tree so that he could listen to the birds that were above him, and to really have that kind of immersive experience where he was connecting with nature. So, I mean, answering the question, I think, I mean, Laing's views on simplicity and also Laing's views on a connected form of travel, taking that on, however it is that you travel. I mean, I've interviewed people who travel by kayak, and I've interviewed people who travel by canoe, and certainly people who travel by motorcycle or by bicycle. And it's kind of like how Robert L. Pirsig says in Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, you know, to travel with it, you're in the scene, not just watching it anymore, which is the tendency when you're inside a car. You know, you tend to be seeing it going by. You're in your own environment with your own music or your own, you know, visual stimuli, you know, your own DVDs or whatever, however you want to do it. But on a motorcycle, it's a very different thing, and you're vulnerable. But sometimes the vulnerability is what really makes the journey. You know, it's what defines it, and quite often what you remember when you get back. Those moments when you connect with other people, when you connect with nature, as Laing did. People sort of are sometimes scared by that vulnerability, but at the same time, it's what can often make it the most memorable. How about you, Geoff? What are the takeaways, do you think?
Obviously, I'm telling a biography about a person who I think contributed a certain amount to, certainly the north of the province. So I'd like people to know more about him, but also about the medical history too. I mean, health insurance is an important part of who we are as Canadians today. And it's always one of the things we say, this is part of our Canadian identity. And people seem to think it started in 1960, but in fact, there's a long history of medical insurance that goes back to the end of the First World War. Not just in British Columbia, although I think we were the leaders in British Columbia. But Alberta had a Health Insurance Act. It's promulgated, but the government changed very, very quickly, and it was cancelled and never really became law. And a lot of other provinces had some form of health insurance in the 30s, local insurance. And I think it's important for people to realize that it didn't all start in 1960, and that we do have that part of identity that goes back to at least the First World War. And that British Columbia was a leader for a number of reasons. Partly because we had a very strong union movement in British Columbia. And in fact, communism had a fairly strong hold in British Columbia in 1919, 1920. There was an economic distress after all the soldiers came back from the First World War and couldn't find jobs. And indeed, the war work industries constricted, and so they let people go. So there's quite a social dynamic happening. And part of that dynamic was we've got to do more to help wounded soldiers and the soldiers of dead families. And it built on the work of Lloyd George in England. And yeah, it's an important part of BC's history that I think people should know more about.
Horace played a large part up north with the Spanish flu. Is that correct?
Oh yeah, the Spanish flu. It's really sadly relevant these days. He was the doctor in Hazelton, running the hospital when the Spanish flu hit in October 1918. And in fact, many of the doctors were still away in the armed services. And so he was also the doctor for Smithers and a large area around. So he was medical officer of health for the region as well. And he closed many churches, closed schools, closed restaurants and cafes. And he, with a few nurses at the hospital, really were the medical team that helped guide the local population through the Spanish flu. And he worked night and day. There's a hotel in New Hazelton that opened up as an auxiliary hospital, and he also arranged for rail cars to be set up as sort of even additional hospitals or additional bedding for overflow people. So he had a very big work to do in keeping the flu at bay, or at least helping people through it. And there were up there too, there were 3 waves of the flu up there. There was a mild one in August of 1918. It was a very mild wave that people didn't realize what it was. There's a big one in October that went through in about a month and then it was over. Then there's a 3rd wave that happened about Christmas. So there were waves of the pandemic up there too. It is a scourge, but they got through it. I hadn't found any references to him urging people wear masks. It was maybe too short a period of time, but I know he did get what he thought or was told was an effective vaccine from Winnipeg, from vaccine laboratories in Winnipeg. And whether or not it worked or not, I don't know, but people thought it worked and they took it happily and they recovered. So but it was said there wasn't an effective vaccine until the 1930s. So I'm not sure what it was that Winnipeg came up with. But anyway, they got through it. So he was very much involved in that. He himself fell ill, his only serious illness of his life, after Christmas in 1918. I've always wondered whether it was, in fact, a version of the flu he got. It could have been, but I just don't know. So he's helped get everyone through it with the nurses at the hospital.
Geoff, changing the subject slightly, there must have been a lot of First Nations people up around there in Hazelton and the hospital. How did Wrinch respond there to the shamans and all of the native
yes.
attempts to cure?
Yes, I mean, good question. Now, obviously, I can't speak in any way for the Gitxsan then or now. I'm certainly not an expert on the relations between the Gitxsan First Nations and Wet'suwet'en First Nations, and there are plenty of writings about that. So I yield to anyone who knows more than I do. I have to say that there probably was some rivalry between the Halates, who were the shamans, and the modern Western medicine. The shamans were the guardians of the spiritual life of the Gitxsan, and they were also the medical doctors as well. So they probably saw modern Western medicine as a rival spiritual force. And I suspect there was some rivalry between them, between the spiritual leaders and the and Horace. However, he appears to have been well liked by the First Nations, and certainly he was very open to them. When he built his house on the grounds of what was a hospital compound in 1902, and a year before he finished the hospital, he used his house as, in effect, hospital. That's where they did surgeries and that's where people convalesced. And of the 34, 35 people who lived in that house, his home, during that 1 year period, over half were First Nations. So the hospital was for them as for anyone else. So he was very, very practical and very, very willing to heal and wanting to heal them as well as anyone else. As far as I can tell, there's no discrimination at that time in the hospital. Looking at the hospital register, the First Nations people were just listed like anyone else. I mean, you've had 2 people there with um, TB, and then you have someone with a broken leg, and someone with a bullet wound, and then some more with another injury of some sort. And there's childbirth, and there's alcoholism, and what have you. The whole list of ills that he dealt with, and the First Nations people were just there like anyone else. So I think it would have been an interesting position for him to come there as a Christian missionary, spreading not just medicine, but also the gospel. But I think also when he arrived, there were missionaries and had been missionaries there for a long time. And in Kisteox, which is the first place he went to, over half the population were Christian, and he helped build the church, and his wife started Sunday school. So he went to very much a receptive community to the Christian word. But nevertheless, I think there was some rivalry. And it's hard to assess how deep that was and how what the feelings were on both sides.
We're reading in the book that at his funeral, there was a tremendous outpouring of the Wet'suwet'en who came to his funeral. Is that correct? Am I remembering correctly?
It is. His wife, Alice, died of cancer in 1922. And when she died, there's a really big funeral in Hazelton. And the leaders of all the native, all the nations around came to the house with flowers, and they all escorted with the native bands, that is the musical bands, escorted the funeral from the Methodist church up the hill to the cemetery on top of the hill overlooking Hazelton. And the bands played, and Robert Tomlinson addressed the First Nations in their own languages. And there appeared to be an outpouring of grief then for Alice Wrinch, his wife. And when Horace died in 1939, he died in Vancouver, and the war had just started. He was buried in Vancouver, but they had a big memorial service in Vancouver, but they had memorial services in Hazelton and in Kisteox, which is where he first went. And it says this is 100% First Nations community then and now. In Kisteox, they held their own service for him, and elders came in and talked to the congregation about how proud they were that the doctor had come to their community first. And they told stories of which was only 36 years before, they told stories of how this young doctor had come to their community and provided so much health care for them. So I can't speak for the Gixan, but when you hear stories like this, you've got to think that he was very much accepted and loved by them, which I think speaks well for his history with them.
A question for Trevor. He's asking social media. Maybe Orla can help out here as well. Yes. How does one use it? For writers, which is the most effective social media? Orla, do you want to jump in? You're our person who deals with social media. You arranged this evening.
Well, personally, I'd say Twitter is the biggest one for writing, I find. I think the writer community on Twitter is quite big, quite large, and yeah, just more talkative in general. Also Facebook. Yeah. What do you think, Trevor?
I finished up with Facebook a couple of years ago. I'd say Twitter is the one I'm most active on. Mm-hmm. I do have an Instagram account. I don't use it too much. Usually, if there's a picture that essentially tells 1,000 words, I'll put it up. But I don't tell too much about myself using Instagram. But yeah, Twitter's been helpful because you can put up a photo and you can. I think it's just the format. Maybe it just appeals to writers all the more. I mean, it is kind of like, it's almost like a small email post, or it's like there's something about it. I'm not sure what it is,
Almost
but it's
a little short diary, short diary
short
entry.
diary. Yeah, it's like a short entry. A day in the life, yeah. I mean, I found that it's been nice to sort of post like an old archive photo of, say, Laing, moto camping, I call it, when he's camping with his motorcycle, and just be able to talk a little bit about that, because I not only can find people who are interested in BC history, but motorcycle travelers, or people who write about motorcycle travel, and they're like, really, they did that 100 years ago? It's for a lot of people, it's like motor camping is something that just happened, since Ewan McGregor and Charlene Boorman went across the world on motorcycles, but it's been happening for a long, long time. And I think that's one other aspect of preparing Laing's account for publication is just that this is one of the earliest accounts of this kind of travel. So in that, it has that kind of cool factor, I think, for motorcycle travelers.
I've been quite disappointed in Twitter, and I got Twitter, and I got Facebook, and I've got a web page. I'm not sure how much interest that has generated, and I've seen reports, and I'm just sort of passing on reports that people can have 5,000 to 10,000 followers on Twitter for their books, but in fact it doesn't lead to many more purchases. So I'm just wondering how one can really use social media to really make waves and acquire interest, because the type of books that I've written, I'm not sure that most Twitter readers would have the slightest interest in it. I just don't know. I'm wondering how best to get the word out there, especially in these days of COVID, when you can't get out there in person, how to get out there and actually get the word out.
You have to tap into the right communities and find them, I suppose. Yeah. And that can be tough.
Yeah. And you can sort of do a hashtag on a Twitter account of saying, BC history, Hazelton, the Skeena River, etc., etc., etc. Does it lead to any more? I don't know. I haven't seen it.
Just going to ask, Trevor seems to have done a little bit with it. And have you worked with Twitter, Geoff?
I've got Twitter, and I've got. You don't speak to me or Trevor. I've got a Twitter account, and I put things on it every now and then. I can't say I've generated much interest from it. I'm just not sure how best to use it.
I think similarly, I haven't found a great deal of interest. It's just kind of been one tool in my arsenal, which has kind of been like, my website is kind of what I will put. I will blog there, and I will blog about certain aspect of the book, and maybe direct people from Twitter to my website and to a blog post that I've made.
Yes, one does that.
Yeah,
but you've got to get people coming to your Twitter page first.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so it's a time-consuming process, and sometimes, there are times I wonder how valuable, how much time it takes. But yeah, it is sort of one tool.
And the web page is fun, and I guess one has to have a web page. And I do put lots of material on the blog. And all my friends love it, but the point is to try and get out there beyond the circle of people who are going to buy the book anyway.
generating traffic, as they say, is
as they say,
is how to get traffic.
Yeah, so there's no magic bullet out there. If there is, please tell me how to market and promote. And everyone says it's got to be the social media. That's where it's all at. Got to be on Instagram and Twitter. Fine, but show me that it works. What you really need is for Beyonce or Justin Timberlake to say, "I love this book," and then you'd have a million hits right away.
Yeah.
I'll add that to the agenda.
That's not so easy to do.
Well, certainly with Amazon and Indigo, I think it pays off. You know, if you've got your friends up there giving you a 5-star review on a book, and they don't know it's your friend, but you have the review there, and you know the sales on Amazon seem to go up. So
Having a review posted on Amazon is quite valuable, isn't it? I mean, I remember when one of my books got reviewed, and I was like, I was on my two, social media pages right away, because I remember just how happy I was that somebody had actually reviewed it. It was I still remember that moment, my first Amazon review.
Yeah. Questions about Geoff's book? Thoughts about the writing, the writing of books, what it does to you? Does it kill you? Does it exhaust you? Does it excite you, leave you excited, or?
I enjoy it. I enjoy the research. That's energizing to go in and look at the original documentation in the BC archives, written in 1900 or even gone further back than that. The original documents, not online or microfilm, but the original documents. I find that very interesting and exciting. And the writing is, I enjoy that. I find it energizes me. What I'm well aware of, though, is that I will write the perfectly finished book, put it aside and come back and do it again, revise it, and then put it aside and come thinking I've done it, no more changes, come back to it again and find all sorts of changes that I want to make. And then I think it's perfect, it's fine, no more changes, right? A week later, I go through it again, there are more changes. So this revision process, going through it time after time after time after time after time. And then my wife looks at it and she's got all sorts of more changes to make. And then Ron looks at it and he's got more changes. So it's the revision process. It's quite something innovating at times.
Like with Geoff, I mean, the real excitement was, having the Laing's travel journal in my hand, knowing that it had gone across the United States with him. And I was, just looked at it and went, it's an extraordinary condition for something which went through all these experiences that I read about in his account. All the elements, all of the in sickness and in health, in all the encounters with creatures and people, and that it was there. And so there's that exciting moment in research when it's in front of you and it was there. Yeah. What stories that notebook could tell, but it's all inside.
Yeah. Do you ever wonder about the stories that he decided not to put into the journal?
Yeah, I wonder about that, because there are several. It's almost like he went. There's a bit of an arc in what he wrote. It started off with being. I think he very much knew that he wanted it to be about the natural world and the birds that he encountered, and then it became something quite different. It became an exploration of the human beings that he encountered. And the things that happen on the road. I think that he couldn't certainly have foreseen being, having alkali poisoning when he drank from a well. He couldn't have, seen foreseen the doctor's help. I mean, he was given copious amounts of milk to drink so that he would get better, and just what it meant to actually get to the continental divide, and the sense of elation and accomplishment that he had when he got up there with his brother. It was something that it started off as one thing, and it really became a larger scope. He took in what was really happening around him. Not that he ignored the birds, but by the end, it was something that was a little bit different, I think.
Trevor, what have you got on your writing plate now?
Well, I'm furthering. It's Laing's. The expedition that Laing was involved in 10 years after his transcontinental motorcycle journey. So in 1925, by this point, he was not on a motorcycle. He was accompanying the expedition that was the first known ascent of Mount Logan in the Yukon. So he was assigned, as expeditions were in those days. He was the biologist assigned to. So he called himself the tail of the kite. He was the biologist that stayed behind while the mountaineers pursued their fate in the ascent of the mountain. And so he stayed actually just on the other side of the border in Alaska at a place called Hubrick's Camp for several weeks. And he got to know the natural world there. He got to know the creatures that surrounded him, the Dall sheep and the various birds. And so it's quite an adventure that he undertook. And also equally with when he was traveling across the United States by motorcycle, he kept a very good diary. So again, that was something I was doing before the pandemic hit.
Yes, when I was researching in the archives in Victoria, I came across scattered in a number of places the letters written back by two Pinkerton's agents who were searching for Simon Gunnanoot. And as you may recall from the book, Simon Gunnanoot was a Gitxsan man who was accused of a double murder in 1906. And the police tried very hard to capture him. And now everyone knows that Pinkerton's agents were up there looking for him as well, but no one knows anything about them. I found that they were writing back a report from Hazelton for almost a year, once or twice a week. So really I'm retelling the Simon Gunnanoot story based only on that 1 year of searching by the Pinkerton's agents. And they're fascinating because they do talk about the people, they talk about First Nations, they talk about Simon Gunnanoot, and at times they were running around in circles and you wonder who was telling the truth, who wasn't telling the truth, and gathering the evidence. So basically it's based around their reports from Hazelton in 1909. So it's true crime, a retelling of a famous murder story. And I'm hoping it's going to come out next spring. So that's what I'm working on.
Fantastic. Well, I wanted to ask you, Geoff, about, but you kind of answered the question already. It was just, whether how many more stories do you come across when you're writing a book like this one, where that you want to expand on and you want to go in that direction?
Oh God, lots. There's lots more in the pike. But one of the problems I haven't mentioned are the rabbit holes one can disappear down in doing research, following all sorts of exciting, completely irrelevant stories. And you go down it, and sometimes you know it's going to be irrelevant, but it's fun anyway. Sometimes they are relevant, but they're just not quite relevant enough to make the grade. But so you gather the information. And one of my practices in the archives is to have my camera with me. So whenever I collect the original information on my camera wherever I can, so that I do have all the information here with me. So which is just as well, because when COVID struck, of course, essentially the archives are closed for a couple of months. They're open now, but you've got to book in advance and go in a hazmat suit and all that good stuff. So I've got a lot of information, a lot of material that relates to the Hazelton area that might or might not form the basis for more books. So the Pinkerton story is one of them. But rabbit holes are great fun. Thank you very much. Thank you, Orla.
Thank you both for doing it as well. And thank you, Ron.
Oh, you're welcome. That was a pleasure.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Geoff, Ron, Orla.
See you, Trevor.
Bye-bye then.
Bye. Take care.
Bye. Thanks.